The rain wouldn't stop that afternoon. It kept falling against the windows of the old university library, creating a rhythm that made everything feel slower, quieter. David was walking between the tall shelves of books when he first noticed her. She was sitting alone at a wooden table in the corner, completely absorbed in her work. Papers were spread everywhere around her, blueprints and drawings covering almost every inch of space. Her hair kept falling forward as she leaned over her sketches, and every few seconds she'd push it back without looking up. He recognized her from the lecture hall. She was one of those students who always sat in the middle rows, never quite at the front but never hiding in the back either. That morning her seat had been empty, and now he understood why. She was here, drowning in what looked like an assignment that had taken over her entire world. David hesitated for a moment. He was just a teaching assistant, not even a real professor yet. But he had the notes from that morning's class, and something about the way she was working, so focused and determined, made him want to help. He walked over slowly, not wanting to startle her. When he cleared his throat softly, she looked up. Her eyes were tired but alert, the kind of tired that comes from working too long on something you actually care about. He introduced himself and mentioned the lecture she'd missed. Before he could offer the notes, she smiled apologetically and explained that she'd been up all night working on this project and had completely lost track of time. They started talking about the assignment. It was about urban planning and how cities could be designed better for the people who actually lived in them. As she explained her ideas, David found himself genuinely interested. She wasn't just completing an assignment. She was trying to solve real problems. She talked about buildings that felt welcoming instead of cold, about neighborhoods where people could actually afford to live, about spaces that made lonely people feel less alone. He pulled out a chair and sat down. What was supposed to be a quick exchange of notes turned into an hour-long conversation. She told him about the buildings she loved in the city, the ones that most people walked past without noticing. He shared his own frustrations about how beautiful designs were often abandoned because they weren't profitable enough. They talked about the gap between what architects dreamed of creating and what actually got built. When the library announced it was closing soon, they both seemed surprised at how much time had passed. David suggested they grab coffee sometime to continue the discussion. She agreed, but there was something careful in the way she said yes, as if she wasn't used to saying yes to things. The next Thursday, they met at a small coffee shop near campus. It became their routine after that. Every week after his lecture, they'd walk to the same place and talk for hours. Sometimes they discussed his research or her projects. Other times, they'd walk through different parts of the city, and she'd point out details he'd never noticed before. The way light hit certain buildings at sunset, how some streets felt safe while others didn't, even though they looked similar. David learned that she saw the world differently than most people. Where others saw an abandoned warehouse, she saw potential. Where others saw an empty lot filled with trash, she saw a community garden waiting to happen. Her imagination wasn't just creative, it was hopeful in a way that made him want to believe in things too. But there were also days when she'd disappear. She'd miss their coffee meetings without explanation, or she'd be quiet and distant when they did meet. He noticed she never talked much about her life outside of school. She'd ask him about his family, his childhood, his dreams, but whenever the conversation turned to her past, she'd skillfully redirect it somewhere else. He didn't push. Something told him that whatever she was carrying, whatever made her sometimes seem so far away even when she was sitting right across from him, wasn't something that could be rushed. Trust, he figured, was something you built slowly, like the good buildings she admired. You couldn't force it. You had to give it time to develop a strong foundation. Months went by like this. Their friendship deepened in small increments. She started staying after the coffee shop closed, and they'd walk through the city at night. The streets were quieter then, and she seemed more comfortable talking. She told him small things about herself, that she'd never lived in one place for very long as a kid, that she taught herself to draw by copying pictures from library books, that she'd always felt like an outsider looking in at other people's normal lives. David shared his own stories too. He told her about growing up in a house that was always too loud, with 3 younger siblings who never gave him a moment of peace. He talked about his mother, who worked 2 jobs but still found time to help with homework every night. He mentioned how he'd chosen urban planning because he'd seen too many good neighborhoods destroyed by developers who only cared about profit. As winter approached, their friendship felt like the most natural thing in the world. They had inside jokes about terrible building designs they'd seen. They texted each other photos of interesting architecture they spotted around the city. She started asking his opinion on her projects, and he valued her perspective on his research more than anyone else's. But David was also beginning to realize something that both excited and scared him. He was falling for her. It wasn't just attraction, though she was beautiful in an understated way that grew on you slowly. It was everything else. The way her whole face changed when she talked about a design idea that excited her, how she remembered small details from conversations they'd had weeks ago. The fact that she could sit in comfortable silence with him, both of them working on separate things but somehow together. He didn't say anything yet. The friendship they had was too valuable to risk. And besides, he wasn't sure if she felt the same way. She kept so much of herself private, protected. There were walls he could sense but couldn't see, boundaries she'd drawn that he didn't fully understand. One evening in late autumn, as they walked through a neighborhood that was being renovated, she stopped in front of an old building that was being torn down. She stared at it for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than usual. She said that sometimes she felt like that building, like there were parts of her that needed to be torn down and rebuilt from scratch. But she was afraid that if she started taking herself apart, she wouldn't know how to put the pieces back together. David didn't know what to say to that. So he just stood there with her, watching the building in the fading light, understanding that sometimes the best thing you can offer someone isn't solutions or advice. Sometimes it's just presence, just being willing to stand beside them while they figure things out. The change didn't happen all at once. It was gradual, like watching seasons shift. 6 months after they'd first met in that library, something between them began to feel different. The careful distance she'd always maintained started to shrink bit by bit. It started on a cold evening in February. David had invited her to a community meeting about a new development project. A construction company wanted to build luxury apartments in a neighborhood where families had lived for generations. The plan would force dozens of people out of their homes, people who couldn't afford to live anywhere else in the city. He thought she might be interested from an academic perspective. He didn't expect what actually happened. She didn't just attend the meeting. She came prepared. She'd spent the previous week creating an alternative design, a plan that would provide the new housing the city needed while keeping the existing community intact. When the floor opened for public comment, she stood up. Her hands were shaking slightly as she unrolled her blueprints, but her voice was steady. For 20 minutes, she presented her vision. She showed how mixed-income housing could work. She explained how thoughtful design could create spaces that brought people together instead of dividing them by economic class. She spoke about community not as an abstract concept, but as something real, something worth protecting. The room was completely silent when she finished. Then people started clapping. Not polite, obligatory applause, but real appreciation. An elderly woman who'd lived in the neighborhood for 40 years came up afterward with tears in her eyes, thanking her for understanding what they stood to lose. Outside in the parking lot, under the orange glow of streetlights, David told her how amazing she'd been. She smiled, but it was a sad smile. Then she started talking, really talking, in a way she never had before. She told him about her childhood, about moving from one foster home to another, never staying anywhere long enough to feel like she belonged. She described what it felt like to always be temporary, to know that your room, your school, your friends could all disappear with a single phone call. She talked about the social worker who was the only constant in those years, the one person who kept showing up, who made her feel like she mattered. That's why architecture meant so much to her, she explained. Buildings were permanent in a way people weren't. If she could design spaces that made others feel secure, feel rooted, maybe she could create for them what she'd never had herself. David reached for her hand. He half expected her to pull away, but she didn't. She let him hold it. And they stood there for a long moment, not saying anything, just being together in a way that felt significant. Things evolved after that night. They still met for coffee, still walked through the city, but now there was something acknowledged between them. He'd reach for her hand while they walked, and she'd let him. She'd lean against his shoulder when they sat on park benches watching people pass by. She started spending more time at his apartment. She met his family when they visited for his birthday. His mother loved her immediately, asking about her work, showing genuine interest in her life. His younger sister, who was usually shy around his friends, sought her out for advice about college applications. She fit into his world so naturally, and he could see her relaxing, letting herself be part of something. He learned more about her daily rhythms. She needed silence in the mornings, absolutely no conversation before her first coffee. When she was anxious, she'd bake elaborate desserts at odd hours. He'd wake up at 2 in the morning to find her in his tiny kitchen, surrounded by flour and sugar, creating intricate pastries while her mind worked through whatever was bothering her. She'd never learned to ask for help directly, but he learned to read the signs to know when she needed space and when she needed company. After she graduated, they decided to move in together. They found a small apartment on the 4th floor of an old building. The lighting was terrible. The kitchen was cramped and the bathroom tiles were an unfortunate shade of green. But it was theirs. She transformed it. She had this ability to take any space and make it feel intentional, comfortable, like home. She hung curtains that filtered the light just right. She arranged furniture in ways that made the small rooms feel larger. She painted an accent wall a deep blue that somehow made everything else look better. David had never been happier. He'd wake up to find her already at the kitchen table, working on her laptop with her coffee getting cold beside her. They'd cook dinner together, badly, laughing at their mistakes. On weekends, they'd explore different neighborhoods, sometimes for her work, sometimes just for the pleasure of discovery. She got a job at a small firm that focused on sustainable, community-centered design. It was exactly the kind of work she'd dreamed about. She won an award for a public library design that incorporated space for people experiencing homelessness. The recognition meant a lot to her. Validation that her ideas weren't just idealistic but actually valuable. For 2 years, life felt solid. David truly believed they were building something that would last. They talked about the future in concrete terms. Maybe buying a small house, possibly getting a dog, eventually starting a family. But even during the good times, there were moments that worried him. Sometimes he'd catch her staring out their living room window with an expression he couldn't read. It wasn't sadness exactly, more like she was somewhere else entirely. When he'd ask what she was thinking about, she'd smile and say nothing important, then change the subject. She'd have nights where she couldn't sleep, where she'd sit on their small balcony for hours just looking at the city lights. He'd join her sometimes, wrapping a blanket around both of them, but she seemed to be wrestling with something she couldn't or wouldn't name. There were also times when she'd withdraw emotionally. Not often, but enough that he noticed the pattern. She'd become quieter, more distant, like she was pulling back into herself. It usually passed after a few days and she'd be present again, fully there with him. He told himself it was just stress from work, or maybe old habits from a childhood where getting too attached to anything was dangerous. He didn't realize these were warnings. He didn't understand that the happiness they shared was sitting on a foundation more fragile than it appeared. He thought love and commitment would be enough. He thought that because they'd built something good together, they'd be able to weather whatever challenges came their way. Looking back later, he'd see all the signs he missed. But in those moments, living day to day, he only saw what he wanted to see. A future that felt certain, a relationship that felt strong, a life they were creating together that seemed unshakable. The unraveling started so slowly that David didn't recognize it as the beginning of the end. It began with small changes in her behavior, things that seemed insignificant at first. She started taking on more projects at work, then even more. Her firm had always been busy, but suddenly she was working 12, 14, sometimes 16-hour days. She'd come home exhausted, eat whatever he'd made for dinner without really tasting it, then go straight to her laptop to work some more. When he suggested she might be overdoing it, she'd brush him off. This was temporary, she'd say. Just a particularly demanding phase. Once these current projects were finished, things would calm down. He wanted to believe her, so he did, but things didn't calm down. One project would finish and she'd immediately take on 2 more. It was like she was running from something, using work as a way to avoid being still, being present. The light that used to be in her eyes when she talked about her designs started to look more like desperation. Then, out of nowhere, her biological mother contacted her. The message came through social media. A woman she hadn't seen or heard from in over 20 years suddenly wanted to meet, wanted to explain, wanted to build a relationship. The woman who'd given her up to the state when she was 5 years old now wanted back into her life. The message broke something in her. David watched it happen, helpless to stop it. She read that message on a Saturday morning, and he saw her face change. All the color drained away. Her hands started shaking. She put her phone down and didn't pick it up again for the rest of the day. She didn't want to talk about it. When he tried to bring it up, she'd shut down completely or leave the room. But the damage was done. Whatever careful balance she'd maintained in her mind, whatever way she'd made peace with her past, that message had destroyed it. She stopped sleeping properly. He'd wake up at 3 or 4 in the morning to find her side of the bed empty. She'd be in the living room or on the balcony just sitting in the dark. Sometimes she'd be working. Other times she'd just be staring at nothing. Her eating became irregular. She'd skip breakfast, forget lunch, then barely touch dinner. When he'd express concern, she'd get defensive, telling him she was fine, that he was worrying over nothing. But he could see her getting thinner, see the exhaustion settling into her bones. Work became either everything or nothing for her. She'd have days where she was manic with productivity, producing brilliant designs at an impossible pace. Then she'd crash and spend entire days in bed, unable to summon the energy to even shower. Her boss called him once, worried, asking if everything was okay at home. David tried everything he could think of. He suggested therapy gently, offering to help her find someone to go with her if she wanted support. She refused, saying she didn't need a stranger poking around in her head. He offered to take time off work so they could get away for a while, maybe visit somewhere peaceful, somewhere she could rest. She said she couldn't take time off, not right now. He tried just being there, being present, not pushing. But even that seemed to bother her. She'd snap at him for small things, for leaving dishes in the sink, for being too loud in the morning, for asking how her day was. They'd apologize to each other afterward, but the tension kept building. The arguments started. Real ones, not just small disagreements. They'd fight about things that didn't actually matter, because talking about what really mattered felt too dangerous. She accused him of treating her like a project, like one of his urban renewal initiatives that needed fixing. He defended himself, saying he just wanted to help, that watching her struggle was killing him. One night, after a particularly bad argument, she said something that hit him like a punch. "Maybe you just love the idea of saving someone. Maybe that's all I've ever been to you." It wasn't true, and part of her knew it wasn't true. But the fact that she could say it showed how far apart they'd drifted. They used to understand each other without words. Now they couldn't communicate even when they were both trying. Her biological mother kept reaching out. Each message would send her spiraling again. David suggested she block the number, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. It was like she was torturing herself, reading these messages from a woman who'd abandoned her, a woman who now wanted forgiveness and relationship without having earned either. He researched trauma, read articles about attachment disorders and abandonment issues, tried to understand what she was going through, but knowing about something intellectually didn't help him know how to actually help her. Every approach he tried seemed to make things worse. Their apartment, which had once felt like a sanctuary, started to feel heavy with tension. The blue wall she'd painted now seemed too dark. The careful arrangements of furniture felt claustrophobic. Even the light coming through her carefully chosen curtains seemed wrong. Then came the Thursday evening that changed everything. He came home from work to find her sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open. She looked up when he walked in, and he knew immediately that something had shifted. Her face had that calm expression she got when she'd made a decision, the kind of calm that was actually terrifying. She told him she'd accepted a job in another city. She'd applied weeks ago without telling him. It was a good opportunity, she said, a chance to work on a major public housing project. But that wasn't why she was going. They both knew it. She was leaving him. Not just the apartment, but him, their relationship, the life they'd built. She needed to figure out who she was on her own, she explained. She couldn't keep depending on him, couldn't keep letting him hold her together. It wasn't fair to him, and it was destroying her. David felt like the floor had disappeared beneath him. He'd known things were bad, but he hadn't thought they were this bad. He hadn't imagined she was planning an exit. He spent the next week trying to change her mind. He suggested couples therapy. He proposed they take a break instead of breaking up completely. He offered to do long distance, to visit on weekends, to do whatever it took to make this work. She listened to all of it with that same terrible calm, then quietly said no to everything. She wasn't angry. That might have been easier. She was just resolved, certain in a way that left no room for negotiation. She'd made up her mind, and nothing he said was going to change it. The final week was one of the hardest things David had ever experienced. She'd given her notice at work and booked movers for the following Saturday. 7 days to dismantle a life they'd built over nearly 3 years. He offered to help her pack, even though it felt like participating in his own heartbreak. She accepted the offer quietly, and they spent those days in a strange, painful dance of cooperation. They wrapped dishes in newspaper, folded clothes into boxes, took down pictures from walls that would never look the same without them. They worked mostly in silence. What was there to say? Everything important had already been said. The arguments were over. The begging was done. Now there was just the mechanical process of separation, of dividing shared things into yours and mine. He noticed she was taking less than half of their belongings, all the furniture she'd chosen, the decorations she'd so carefully selected. Most of it she was leaving behind. When he asked why, she said she wanted to start fresh with nothing carrying memories. He didn't say what he was thinking, that you can't run away from memories, that they follow you wherever you go. His mother called during that week. His sister had told her what was happening, and she wanted to check on him. She asked if there was anything she could do, anything that might help. He appreciated it, but what could anyone do? Sometimes things just end, and all you can do is survive it. Friends reached out too, offering support, offering to take him out for drinks, offering the kind of well-meaning help that doesn't actually help. He thanked them, but mostly stayed in the apartment with her, as if witnessing every moment of the ending would somehow make it more real, more acceptable. On Thursday evening, 2 days before the movers were scheduled to arrive, they ordered food from the Thai restaurant they used to love. They sat on the floor of their mostly empty living room, eating pad thai from containers, and for a moment it almost felt like old times. Almost, but not quite. The ghosts of who they used to be sat between them, making everything feel hollow. She thanked him for everything. For being patient with her, for trying so hard, for giving her 3 years that she'd treasure even though they were ending. He wanted to be angry at that, wanted to tell her that treasured memories weren't enough, but he was too tired for anger. He just nodded and kept eating food he couldn't taste. Friday was the hardest day. The apartment was almost completely packed. There was barely any furniture left. They'd be sleeping on a mattress on the floor, like they had the first night they'd moved in together. The parallel was too painful to acknowledge out loud. That evening, she made one final batch of her elaborate desserts, a chocolate cake with layers of ganache and raspberry filling, the kind of thing that took hours of careful work. It was stress baking taken to its absolute extreme. When it was done, they sat on the kitchen floor and ate it straight from the pan with 2 forks, because all the plates were packed. "I need you to let me go," she said suddenly, breaking the silence. "I know that's a terrible thing to ask, but I need you to really let me go. Not just physically, but in your heart." He looked at her, at the chocolate smudged at the corner of her mouth, at the exhaustion in her eyes. "Why?" he asked. "Why does it have to be this way?" She set down her fork and took a shaky breath. "Because I need to know I can survive alone. I need to know that I'm a whole person without someone holding me together. Every time you helped me, every time you supported me, part of me felt grateful and part of me felt weaker. I know that's not your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. But I can't be with anyone until I figure out how to be with myself. And you have to be in another city to do that?" "Yes," she said simply. "Because if I stay here, I'll end up at your door the first time things get hard. And you'll take me back because that's who you are, and we'll be right back where we started, with me dependent and scared and you trying to save something that can't be saved." He understood what she was saying, intellectually, but understanding didn't make it hurt less. "What if you figure it out?" he asked. "What if you do the work and heal and become whoever you need to become? Would you come back then?" She looked at him with infinite sadness. "I don't know. I honestly don't know. And it wouldn't be fair to ask you to wait for something that might never happen." They didn't sleep much that night. They lay on the mattress, not touching but aware of each other's presence, both of them knowing these were the last hours they'd spend together like this. Saturday morning arrived too quickly and too slowly. The movers came at 9. They were efficient, professional, loading her boxes and few pieces of furniture into the truck within an hour. David helped carry things down because what else was he going to do? Stand aside and watch? When the truck was loaded, there was nothing left to do but say goodbye. They stood in the empty living room in the space that had been their home. The walls still had the paint colors she'd chosen. The floors still bore the slight scuff marks from their furniture. But it was just a room now, not a home anymore. She picked up her last bag, the one she was taking in her car. She looked around one final time and he could see her memorizing the space, filing it away with all the other places she'd had to leave behind. They walked down to the street together. Her car was packed tight with the essentials she'd need for the first few days. Everything else would arrive with the movers later that week. She stood by the driver's side door, keys in hand. "Thank you," she said, "for everything, for seeing me, for trying, for loving me even when I made it so hard." He wanted to say so many things. He wanted to tell her she was making a mistake, that they could figure this out together, that love was supposed to be enough. But he'd said all of that already and it hadn't changed anything. So instead he just said, "Take care of yourself." She nodded, opened the car door, then paused. She turned back to him one more time, and he saw tears in her eyes that she wouldn't let fall. Then she got in the car. David stood on the sidewalk watching. She started the engine but didn't pull away immediately. She sat there for a long moment, hands on the steering wheel, looking straight ahead. He could see her shoulders rise and fall with deep breaths, could see her gathering the courage or the strength or whatever it took to actually drive away. When she finally did start moving, she drove slowly. Impossibly slowly. The street was empty and she could have pulled away quickly, but she didn't. She crept forward at a crawl, and he understood. She was giving herself time to change her mind, giving him time to chase after her, giving them both one last chance to stop this. But he didn't chase her. He stayed planted on that sidewalk, even though every cell in his body was screaming at him to run after her car. Because if he stopped her now, it would only be delaying the inevitable. She told him what she needed, and loving her meant respecting that, even when it was killing him. She turned the corner at the end of the street, moving so slowly that she was barely advancing. Then she was gone. David stood there long after her car disappeared. People walked past him on the sidewalk, going about their normal Saturday activities, completely unaware that his world had just ended. Cars drove by. A dog barked somewhere. Life continued, indifferent to personal tragedy. Eventually, he walked back up to the apartment. The empty rooms echoed with his footsteps. He went to the living room window, the same window where she used to stand staring at the city. He looked down at the street, at the spot where her car had been parked, as if looking would somehow bring her back. He stayed at that window for hours. The sun moved across the sky. Shadows lengthened. The day passed. And still he stood there, because moving away from that window felt like the final goodbye, the ultimate admission that she was really gone. As long as he stood there, some irrational part of him could believe she might come back, might pull up to the curb with all her boxes still packed, ready to try again. But she didn't come back. The street remained empty of her, and slowly, painfully, David began to accept that sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let someone go, even when everything in you wants to hold on. Time moved differently after she left. Days blurred together in a way that made David feel like he was underwater, moving through thick, heavy water that resisted every motion. He went to work, came home, ate when he remembered to, slept when exhaustion overtook him. He was functioning technically, but not really living. The apartment felt wrong without her. He'd lie in bed and reach for her side automatically, forgetting for a split second each morning that she wasn't there. Her coffee mug still sat in the cabinet. Her terrible shower curtain with the weird abstract pattern was still hanging in the bathroom because he couldn't bring himself to take it down. Little pieces of her remained scattered throughout the space, small reminders that made his chest ache. His friends tried to help in the way friends do. They invited him out, dragged him to bars and restaurants, tried to distract him with normalcy. He appreciated it, but their efforts mostly just made him tired. He'd smile and nod and pretend to be engaged in conversations about sports or politics or work gossip, but inside, he was somewhere else, still standing on that sidewalk watching her car disappear. After a month of this half-life, his sister came to visit. She took one look at the apartment, at him, and made an executive decision. She spent the weekend helping him pack up his own things. He needed to move, she said. Living in this space was like living in a museum dedicated to his grief. He needed a fresh start even if he didn't want one. She was right. He found a different apartment across town, smaller and cheaper. It didn't have good light or the charm of the old place, but it was his alone. It had no memories of her painted into its walls. Moving didn't heal anything, but it did make day-to-day existence slightly less painful. Work became his refuge. He threw himself into the affordable housing nonprofit he'd always talked about starting. He applied for grants, recruited board members, developed plans for their first project. It gave him somewhere to put all the energy that used to go into their relationship. If he couldn't fix what was broken in his personal life, at least he could try to fix something in the world. The nonprofit actually gained traction. They secured funding for a pilot program, bought a small building that had been abandoned for years, began renovating it into studio apartments for people transitioning out of homelessness. It was good work, meaningful work, and occasionally he'd find himself actually feeling something other than numb. 4 months after she left, he got a text message. Her name appearing on his phone screen made his heart jump in a way that annoyed him. The message was brief. An apology for how things ended, a hope that he was doing well, a polite inquiry about his life. It was the kind of message you send when you're testing the waters, seeing if communication is possible. He stared at that message for an hour before responding. He kept his reply equally brief and polite. He mentioned the nonprofit, asked about her new job, kept everything surface level and safe. It felt both necessary and insufficient, like they were two strangers making small talk rather than two people who'd once known each other completely. The messages continued after that, every few weeks. Never about anything deep, never touching on what had happened between them. Just updates. Her project was going well. His building renovation was ahead of schedule. The weather was nice. How was his family? It was strange to communicate with her this way, trading information but not connection. Through mutual friends, he learned more than what she told him directly. She was in therapy, finally. She was doing good work, designing a community center that would serve homeless youth. She'd started running marathons, pushing her body to its limits in a way that the friend who told him seemed to think was healthy, but David suspected might be another form of running away. He dated occasionally. A woman from the nonprofit board asked him out, and he said yes because it seemed like the thing to do. She was nice, intelligent, shared his values. They went on several dates. She made him laugh a few times, but he could tell she knew his heart wasn't in it, and eventually she gently ended things. He was relieved. There were other women after that, not many, but a few. Coffee dates and dinners and one brief relationship that lasted almost 3 months before fizzling out. They were all perfectly fine people. That was the problem, actually. They were fine, but they weren't her. He'd find himself comparing them to her in ways that weren't fair to anyone involved. The way they laughed wasn't quite right. They didn't see the city the way she did. They needed him in different ways or didn't need him at all, and both felt wrong. A year passed, then another 6 months. David's life had rebuilt itself around the hole she'd left. The nonprofit was thriving. He'd been promoted at the university. He had routines and rhythms that worked. He was okay, genuinely okay most of the time, but there was still a part of him that was waiting, even though he tried not to admit that to himself. Then, on a random Tuesday afternoon while he was reviewing building permits, his phone rang. Her name on the screen, not a text this time, but an actual call. His hand shook slightly as he answered. Her voice sounded different. Steadier, maybe. More grounded. They exchanged the usual pleasantries, but he could tell she hadn't called just to chat about the weather. There was something she needed to say. She told him she'd been thinking about him a lot lately. About them. About how things ended. She said her therapist had helped her understand things she hadn't been able to see before. About how her childhood had taught her that attachment meant abandonment. That depending on people meant eventual disappointment. About how she'd run from him not because he wasn't enough, but because he was too much. Because loving him and letting him love her had terrified her in ways she hadn't known how to handle. She talked about how leaving him had been the hardest thing she'd ever done. Harder than any foster home placement. Harder than any academic challenge, harder than facing her biological mother's messages. Because this time she was the one doing the abandoning. She was choosing to walk away from something good. Something real. And that choice had haunted her every single day since. But it had also been necessary, she said. She'd needed to learn that she could survive on her own. She'd needed to build a foundation of self-worth that didn't depend on someone else's presence or approval. She'd needed to understand that she was worthy of love not because someone gave it to her, but because she existed. David listened to all of this, his throat tight. When she finished, there was a long silence. Then she asked if he was still there. "I'm here," he said. "I'm not asking to get back together," she clarified quickly. "I'm not calling to say I've fixed everything and now we can try again. I needed you to know that it was never about you. You didn't fail me. You didn't do anything wrong. I was just too broken to let myself be loved, and that wasn't something you could fix. Are you less broken now?" he asked, and immediately regretted the question. It sounded harsh, even though he hadn't meant it that way, but she didn't take offense. "I don't know if less broken is the right way to think about it," she said. "I think I'm just broken in a way I understand now. I know where the cracks are. I know what triggers me. I know when I'm running away from something versus when I'm running toward something. And I've learned how to stand still," which sounds simple but for me was revolutionary. They talked for 2 hours. It was the most honest conversation they'd had since before everything fell apart. She told him about her therapy journey, about confronting her biological mother and setting boundaries, about learning to sit with discomfort instead of drowning it in work. He told her about the nonprofit, about the people they'd helped find housing, about slowly rebuilding a life that felt meaningful, even if it looked different than he'd planned. Near the end of the call, she said something that stayed with him. "I still love you. I probably always will. But I finally understand that loving someone doesn't mean you get to be with them. Sometimes loving someone just means being grateful they existed in your life and hoping they're happy, even if that happiness is separate from you." David felt something shift in his chest. It wasn't closure exactly. It was more like acceptance. "I still love you too," he admitted. "But you were right. I had to stop waiting. I had to build a life that worked whether you came back or not." "Did you?" she asked. "Build a life that works?" He thought about it honestly before answering. "Yeah," he said, "I did. It's not the life I planned, and there's still a U-shaped hole in it. But it works. I'm okay." "I'm glad," she said, and he could hear the sincerity in her voice. "You deserve to be more than okay. You deserve everything good." When they finally hung up, David sat at his desk for a long time, not moving. Something had changed. The call hadn't given him what some part of him had always hoped for. It hadn't brought her back. But it had given him something else, something he hadn't known he needed. Understanding. He understood now that her leaving hadn't been a rejection of him or what they'd had. It had been a desperate act of self-preservation by someone who hadn't known any other way to survive. He understood that love, real love, sometimes meant watching someone walk away slowly, respecting their need to figure themselves out even when it tore you apart. And most importantly, he understood that he'd finally let her go, not the bitter forced letting go he'd tried to do in the months after she left.